Oh my God, look closely. That's my old classmate. Poor then poorer now. Must feel honored just to scrub the floor at my wedding. Laughter rippled through the grand hall, blending with the polished hum of the orchestra. The bride lifted her gown with practiced grace, deliberately spilling her wine so her former classmate would have to kneel and clean it. The woman said nothing, her calm eyes unreadable as she murmured, "You're right. Some people never change." The crowd burst out laughing until the most powerful man in the room rose to his feet, stepping into the glare of 100 flashing cameras. His voice was low, steady, and ice cold. "You're right, but she's not the janitor. She's my wife." Lyra Valine knelt there, rag in hand, her gray janitor's uniform damp from the spilled wine. The gold-plated chandeliers above cast a warm glow, but it didn't reach her. The room was a sea of silk dresses and tailored suits, every guest a name, a face, a status. She didn't belong, not in their eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a plain bun, no makeup, no jewelry. Just her hands steady moving the rag in slow circles. She didn't look up, didn't flinch even as the laughter swelled. Her face stayed calm, almost too calm, like she was holding something heavy behind those quiet eyes. The bride Celeste Draven stood over her, all diamonds and confidence, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. The moment hung there cruel and deliberate, like a scene someone had scripted just to watch Lyra break. The Dorn Regal's grand hall was a cathedral of wealth, marble floors, velvet drapes, and a ceiling painted with angels, who probably cost more than most people's homes. Lyra moved through it like a ghost, her mop gliding silently. Celeste the bride was impossible to miss. 28, with a face that screamed money, perfectly sculpted brows, a dress that cost more than a car, and a laugh that carried like she owned the air itself. She'd always been like that even back in high school, where she'd glide through the halls, her clique trailing her like planets orbiting a star. Now she spotted Lyra, and her eyes lit up with something mean. "Oh, honey," she called out loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Did our old school start offering degrees in floor scrubbing?" The crowd tittered, glasses clinking, as they leaned in to watch. A young woman in a sequin dress, her hair dyed platinum, and her nails painted to match, sidled up to Celeste, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Is that really her? God, I remember her in school, always so invisible." She flicked her wrist, dismissing Lyra with a wave, then turned to her friend, a stocky man in a velvet blazer. "Bet she's thrilled to be here, cleaning up after us." The man snorted loud enough for heads to turn. Lyra kept working her mop steady, but her knuckles whitened slightly around the handle. She didn't look at them. Instead, she reached for a bucket, her movements precise, like she was carving out space for herself in the chaos. The woman laughed again, louder, egging on the crowd. "Maybe we should tip her for the show," she said, tossing a coin toward Lyra. It spun in the air, landing near her feet with a sharp clink. Lyra paused, glanced at it, then said, "Some people pay more for attention than others." The crowd chuckled, but the woman's smile froze, her eyes narrowing. Vera Dorn. Celeste's mother stood nearby, her silver hair piled high, her neck dripping with pearls. 50 years old, she carried herself like royalty, her voice crisp and cutting. "If I'd known you'd end up like this, dear," she said, stepping closer to Lyra, "I'd have paid for a scholarship. At least then, you wouldn't be embarrassing yourself at my daughter's wedding." Her smile was all teeth, the kind that made you feel small just for existing. Lyra didn't answer. She just kept wiping the floor, her movement steady, her face blank. A few guests snapped photos, their phones flashing like vultures circling. One of them, a wiry guy in a too-tight suit, smirked and said, "This is like Cinderella, but the fairy godmother forgot to show up." The room laughed again, louder this time. Celeste wasn't done. She tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the light. "You know, Lyra, I always wondered what happened to you after high school. Guess I don't need to anymore." She lifted her glass, then tipped it just enough for another splash of red wine to hit the floor, right where Lyra was cleaning. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with fake apology. "Go on, clean it up. It's your chance to wipe away that sad little past of yours." The words landed like a slap, and the room went quiet, waiting for Lyra's reaction. She paused just for a second, her hand tightening on the rag. Then she looked up, her eyes locking onto Celeste's. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Some pasts need a good cleaning." The crowd chuckled, thinking she was playing along, but something in her tone made Celeste's smile falter just for a moment. As Lyra bent to clean the new spill, a teenage girl in a pastel dress, probably a cousin of Celeste's, giggled from a nearby table. Her braces glinted as she whispered to her friend, loud enough for others to hear. She's probably used to this by now. I mean, look at her shoes. Those soles are practically begging for a mop. The friend, a lanky boy with slicked back hair, laughed so hard he snorted. Lyra's hands slowed for a moment, her fingers brushing the worn edge of her shoe. She stood, straightened her back, and looked at the girl. "Shoes wear out when you actually walk in them," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle. The girl's giggle died in her throat, her cheeks flushing as the table around her went quiet. Lyra turned back to her work, but the air felt heavier now, like the room was starting to notice her. A man in a navy suit pushed through the crowd, his presence shifting the air. Magnus Orion 35 was the kind of guy who didn't need to announce himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that could have been carved from stone. He moved like he owned the room without trying. His name was whispered in boardrooms, not shouted in headlines. He was a billionaire, but the quiet kind, the kind who didn't need to flash it. When Lyra stood to grab a fresh rag, he caught her eye and gave a small nod, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. She nodded back, barely noticeable, and went back to her work. Vera saw it, her lips tightening. "Oh, don't mind him," she said loudly, waving a hand. "Magnus is just polite to everyone, even the help." Across the hall, a group of Celeste's old classmates gathered near a champagne fountain, their laughter sharp and practiced. One of them, a woman with a sleek bob and a designer clutch, pointed at Lyra. Remember her in biology, always raising her hand like she thought she was better than us. She sipped her drink, her eyes glinting with malice. Guess she learned her place. Another classmate, a man with a goatee and a Rolex, chimed in. "Yeah, I bet she's still got that same backpack from senior year." Pathetic. Lyra was stacking dirty glasses nearby, her hands steady, but she paused when she heard her name. She set a glass down, the clink loud in the sudden hush. "Some things last longer than others," she said, her voice low, her eyes on the glass. The group froze, their smirks fading as she walked away, her steps measured, leaving them to stew in their own silence. Celeste laughed, tossing her hair. "Yeah, he's probably just being nice. No need to get any ideas, Lyra." The words were light, but they carried a warning like she was marking her territory. A few guests exchanged glances, sensing something off. Cassian Rowe, the hotel manager, stood off to the side, his arms crossed. 32, with sharp eyes and a pressed suit, he'd known Lyra since they were kids. He watched the scene unfold, his jaw tight like he was holding back words he couldn't say. A reporter in a cheap blazer leaned over to her colleague, whispering, "Did you see that?" Magnus never looks at anyone like that. The room kept buzzing, but Lyra just kept moving her hands, steady, her face unreadable. Later, during a break, Lyra slipped into a corner near the service entrance, her hands folded in her lap. Celeste followed her heels, clicking like a predator's claws. "I'm honestly shocked you're still in this city," she said, her voice sugary, like she was trying to be kind. "I mean, after everything, I thought you'd have crawled back to whatever hole you came from." Lyra didn't look up. She just adjusted the hem of her uniform, her fingers careful, deliberate. Celeste leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're still too proud to talk. People like you don't get to be proud." A group of their old classmates appeared, phones out, snapping selfies with Celeste. They angled the shot so Lyra was in the background, her gray uniform stark against their glittering dresses. A waiter, young and nervous, tripped nearby, dropping a tray of canapes. The crash drew every eye, and Celeste seized the moment. "Oh, look, Lyra's got company," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "Maybe you two can start a club for people who don't belong here." The waiter's face flushed, his hands scrambling to pick up the mess. Lyra knelt beside him, silently helping him gather the scattered food. She didn't say a word, but her hands moved with purpose, steadying his shaking ones. The waiter glanced at her, his eyes grateful, then looked away, embarrassed. Celeste watched her smile tightening, like she'd expected Lyra to shrink, but found her standing taller instead. The crowd murmured, some uncomfortable, others amused, but Lyra just kept helping her silence louder than their laughter. Vera joined in, her voice carrying across the hall. "You know, darling, hard work is sweet, but it doesn't buy you a seat at this table. You need blood, not sweat, to belong here." She gestured to the room, her rings flashing. The crowd nodded, some smirking, others looking away, uncomfortable, but not enough to speak up. Celeste reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp envelope, tossing it at Lyra's feet. "Here," she said, her smile tight. "A little wedding gift. Buy yourself something that doesn't scream janitor." The envelope landed with a soft thud, and the room held its breath. Lyra picked it up, her movements slow, and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. I'll find a good use for it. The crowd laughed, but it was nervous now, like they weren't sure who was winning. Near the dessert table, a middle-aged investor in a pinstripe suit leaned toward his wife, his voice carrying just far enough. That girl's got no business being here. Look at her dressed like she's cleaning a gas station. His wife, her lips Botoxed into a permanent pout, nodded. It's almost sad, isn't it? Like she's trying to play dress-up with the wrong costume. Lyra was refilling a water pitcher nearby, her hands steady, but she stopped for a moment, her fingers brushing the pitcher's handle. She turned just enough to meet the man's eyes and said, "Some costumes hide more than you think." Her voice was calm, but it cut through the chatter, leaving the couple blinking their mouths half open. The wife clutched her purse, suddenly interested in her phone, while the man coughed and turned away. Cassian appeared at Lyra's side, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. He handed her a folded piece of paper, his voice low. "You dropped this earlier." She took it without a word, slipping it into her apron. It wasn't just any paper. It was a leaked memo from Dorn Holdings, detailing a $1.2 billion deal with Orion Industries, Magnus's company. Celeste, oblivious, was holding court near the stage, her voice loud as she bragged to a group of investors. "After tonight, my family's locking down the Asia transport market. Exclusive contracts signed and sealed." She raised her glass, basking in the applause. Lyra unfolded the memo, glanced at it, then looked at Celeste. "Congratulations," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But are you sure they're ready to commit long-term?" The room went quiet, and Celeste laughed sharp and forced. "What, a janitor's giving me business advice now?" A photographer, his camera slung around his neck, hovered near Lyra, snapping shots without asking. "Hey, sweetheart," he called, his voice oily. "Give us a smile for the before picture. You know, before you go back to your real life." The crowd around him chuckled, egging him on. Lyra set her mop against the wall, her movements slow, deliberate. She turned to face him, her eyes steady, and said, "You might want to save that shot for the after." The photographer's grin faltered his camera, lowering slightly. The crowd shifted, some whispering, others craning their necks to see what would happen next. Lyra picked up her mop again, her face calm, but the air around her felt charged, like she'd just dropped a match into dry grass. The laughter didn't last. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Magnus entered the hall again, this time with purpose. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just moved his steps, deliberate, his eyes fixed on Lyra. Celeste stepped forward, her smile bright, ready to charm him. "Mr. Orion." I'm so glad she started, but he cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "You're not who I'm here to see." He turned to his assistant, a wiry man with a tablet, and said, "Pause the Dorn Holdings contract. Indefinitely." The words landed like a bomb. Vera's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. "Why?" she stammered, her voice shaking. Magnus looked at her, then at Celeste. "I don't work with people who disrespect human dignity," he said. The room froze, every eye on him, then on Lyra, who just stood there wiping her hands on her apron. A woman in a red gown, her perfume sharp enough to sting, leaned toward her friend, whispering loudly enough for Lyra to hear. "Can you believe they let someone like her in here? She's dragging down the whole vibe." Her friend, a man with a manicured beard, nodded. "Yeah, it's like inviting a stray dog to a banquet." Lyra was nearby, stacking chairs to clear a path for the waitstaff. She paused, her hands still on the chair's back, and looked at them. "Dogs don't need an invitation to know their worth," she said, her voice low but clear. The woman's jaw dropped, her fan snapping shut. The man choked on his drink, coughing, as the crowd around them went silent, their eyes darting between Lyra and the couple. Lyra moved on her steps unhurried, leaving them to stew in their embarrassment. The press went wild. Phones were out, cameras flashing, reporters whispering into their mics. "Dorn Holdings deal canceled mid-wedding," one shouted. Vera turned on Celeste, her face red. "You idiot! You've ruined us," she hissed, her voice carrying over the music. Celeste's eyes darted around, desperate, until they landed on Lyra. "It's her," she screamed, pointing. "That little janitor seduced him. She's been playing us." The crowd parted as Celeste stormed toward Lyra, grabbing a glass of water from a waiter and throwing it in her face. "Get out," she yelled. "Before I call the cops." Lyra didn't move. Water dripped down her cheek, but her eyes stayed steady, unflinching. Cassian stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You can't kick her out, Celeste. She's a shareholder in Orion Industries." In a quiet corner, a hotel staff member, an older woman with tired eyes, approached Lyra during a lull. She held a tray of empty glasses, her hands shaking slightly. "I saw what they did," she whispered, glancing nervously at Celeste's table. "I've been here 20 years. They treat us all like that." Lyra set her mop down, her eyes softening as she looked at the woman. She reached out gently, touching her arm. "You're worth more than their words," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The woman's eyes welled up, her hand steadying on the tray. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked away, her shoulders a little straighter. The moment was small, but it rippled a few guests nearby, watching their conversations faltering as they saw Lyra's quiet strength. A group of investors huddled near the bar, their voices low but sharp. One, a balding man with a gold watch, gestured toward Lyra. "She's got no place here. This is a high-stakes event, not a charity case." His colleague, a woman with a tight smile and a pearl necklace, nodded. "It's embarrassing, really. They should screen the staff better." Lyra was nearby, wiping down a table, her movements slow and deliberate. She straightened her eyes, meeting the man's, and said, "High stakes don't always mean high character." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The man's face reddened, his mouth, opening and closing like a fish. The woman beside him clutched her necklace, her smile gone. The crowd around them shifted, some nodding, others looking away, the tension palpable. Magnus stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding every inch of the space. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "Let me introduce you," he said, his eyes on Lyra, "to my wife, Lyra, Orion." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the room. Cameras swiveled, zooming in on Celeste's pale face. Then Vera's, who sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "His wife," Vera whispered, her voice barely audible. Lyra reached up, unclipping the janitor badge from her uniform. She let it fall to the floor, her smile small but steady. "I wanted to see who'd look past a title," she said, her voice clear, "and see a person." Magnus placed a hand on her shoulder. "I saw enough," he said. "A reporter," her notepad clutched tightly, pushed through the crowd, her voice trembling with excitement. "Mrs. Orion, did you plan this? To let them humiliate you?" Lyra turned, her eyes steady, and said, "I didn't plan their words. I just gave them the chance to say them." The reporter scribbled furiously, her pen shaking. The crowd murmured, some in awe, others in disbelief, as Lyra's words sank in. She didn't explain further, didn't need to. Her silence was enough, her presence a rebuke to every cruel word thrown her way. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every angle of her calm, unyielding face. Celeste's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of a table, her eyes wild. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't ruin my wedding. Don't destroy my family." Vera, tears streaming down her face, dropped to her knees in front of Lyra, reaching for her hand. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice desperate. Lyra stepped back, her face calm but firm. "I don't need anyone kneeling," she said. "I just need people to stop tearing others down." Celeste's voice rose to a shriek. "You think you can steal my happiness just because you've got money now?" Lyra met her eyes, unflinching. "No, Celeste," she said. "I'm just taking back the respect you stole from me." As the crowd watched, a young man in a waiter's uniform slipped through the chaos, his eyes wide with recognition. He'd gone to high school with Lyra and Celeste, always on the sidelines, unnoticed. He approached Lyra, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember you," he said. "You helped me with math when no one else would." Lyra looked at him, her face softening. She nodded just once and said, "You made it here too." The man smiled, his eyes shining, and stepped back, blending into the crowd. The moment was fleeting, but it landed like a quiet thunderclap, a reminder of who Lyra had always been. Someone who saw people, not just their place in the room. The orchestra shifted, the music slowing, then stopping. Magnus raised a hand and the room fell silent again. "This wedding will go on," he said, his voice steady. "But it's not for who you think." The lights dimmed, then brightened, focusing on Lyra. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, her gray uniform somehow commanding now every eye on her. Cassian grinned from the sidelines, his arms crossed like he'd known this was coming all along. The reporters were frantic, shouting into their phones. "Janitor turned billionaire's wife." One yelled, "The wedding twist of the century." Flowers fell from the ceiling, confetti catching the light as the music swelled again, this time for her. A woman in a velvet shawl, her face lined with years of high society events, stood near the exit watching Lyra. She'd been quiet all night, her eyes sharp, observant. As Lyra passed, she reached out, her voice low. "I was like you once," she said. "They laughed at me too. Don't ever let them dim you." Lyra paused, her hand brushing the woman's, briefly her eyes warm. "I won't," she said, her voice steady. The woman nodded, her lips trembling, and stepped back, her shawl slipping slightly as she disappeared into the crowd. The exchange was quick, but it carried weight, a thread of connection that made the room feel smaller, more human. Lyra took Magnus's arm, her movements slow, deliberate. The crowd erupted in applause, some genuine, some stunned, but it didn't matter. She didn't look back at Celeste, who stood frozen tears streaking her perfect makeup. Vera was still in her chair, her hands covering her face. The cameras followed Lyra and Magnus as they walked out their steps in sync, the room buzzing behind them. The headlines were already writing themselves, "Dorn Empire Crumbles," as Janitor revealed as Billionaire's wife. Celeste's face was everywhere by morning, not as the triumphant bride, but as the woman who'd lost it all in one night. A security guard, his badge glinting under the chandeliers, stood near the door as Lyra and Magnus passed. He'd been watching all night, his face impassive. As Lyra walked by, he tipped his head slightly, his voice gruff but kind. "You showed 'em, ma'am." Lyra glanced at him, her smile small but real. "They showed themselves," she said, her voice soft. The guard's eyes crinkled, a rare smile breaking through. He stepped back, holding the door open, his posture straighter than it had been all night. The crowd didn't notice, but the moment felt like a quiet victory, a nod from someone who'd seen too many nights like this. The fallout came fast. Celeste's wedding photos, meant to be her crowning moment, were overshadowed by viral clips of her throwing water at Lyra. The internet tore her apart, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. Sponsors dropped her, citing brand misalignment. Vera's social circle turned their backs, her invitations to elite galas quietly rescinded. The wiry guy who'd mocked Lyra as Cinderella lost his job at a PR firm when his boss saw the video. Even the classmate who'd snapped selfies with Lyra in the background got called out online. Her modeling contract canceled after the backlash. It wasn't revenge, it was just the truth catching up, like a tide that had been held back too long. A delivery driver unloading crates outside the hotel caught wind of the chaos through a cracked window. He'd seen Lyra earlier carrying buckets and assumed she was just another worker like him. Now, hearing the whispers of her true identity, he stopped, his hands resting on a crate. He looked toward the hall where Lyra's silhouette was visible through the glass doors and muttered to himself, "Damn, she played them all." He shook his head, a grin spreading across his face, and went back to his work, whistling a tune. The story was already spreading from the hotel to the streets, a spark that would burn for weeks. Lyra didn't stay to watch it unfold. She and Magnus left the city that night, their car disappearing into the quiet streets. She didn't gloat, didn't post about it, didn't need to. Her silence said everything. She'd walked into that room as a janitor, let them tear her down, and walked out as herself, whole, unbroken, seen. The world knew her name now, not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it. Silences speak louder than screams. You've been there, haven't you? Judged, dismissed, made to feel small. But you kept going, you held your ground. And you weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.